Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the AIF Theatre. My name's Don Aers. I'm the Technical Director for PASMA. And today I'd like to talk to you about some new guidance that PASMA has just published about protecting the public around mobile access towers and where these mobile access towers are used on the highway. So the Highways Act 1980, Section 169, control of scaffolding on highways. And what that says is no person shall, in connection with any building or demolition work or the alteration, repair, maintenance or cleaning of any building, erect or retain on or over a highway any scaffolding or other structure. So it's very clear that if you're placing any scaffolding on or over the highway, then it must be licensed by the highway authority. These requirements also apply to a mobile access tower. And not everyone realises that, but it is a form of scaffolding. Mobile access towers are structures that are assembled using prefabricated modular components in conformance to a product standard, EN 1004, and where the dimensions are fixed by the design. You can't change these around subtly. They're modular components, so they're, by that very nature, they're fixed by design. And mobile towers, in accordance with EN 1004, are capable of being used either freestanding, and they can have one or more working platforms. Structures such as this, and this structure is built using mobile access tower components, are specified in a product standard BS 1139 Part 6. And although they're commonly referred to as mobile access towers, this type of access is not always mobile, as it is in this structure here. They can be built on base plates rather than wheels, because for reasons of safety, sometimes it's actually better to build it on a base plate than to put it on a wheel. If you don't need to move it, it's probably safer on a base plate. And in some cases, they're actually tied to the structure of the building in the same way that you'd tie in a conventional form of scaffolding. So what's the definition of a highway? Well, it's actually not defined in the Highways Act, strangely enough. But it's a way over which the public have a right to pass and repass, and which may or may not be publicly maintained. That's an important point that you need to consider. And it may consist of a carriageway, footway, pavement or verge. And it can also be a footpath, bridleway or cycleway. So for those of you who were thinking it was the M1 or the A20 or whatever, it can be a lot more than that. And that's what is considered to be the highway. So PASMA's now published a new guidance document on the subject of using mobile towers on the highway in order to assist the persons responsible for towers and the authorities responsible for that licensing. But more importantly, it's to do with protecting the public. You can note the catchy title, Guidance Notes and Application for a License to Assemble and Use a Mobile Tower on the Highway. It's got a particular ring to it, don't you think? There is another document out there which is for conventional scaffolding on the highway, and that's to do with tube and fit scaffolding. But this is nothing like it, because mobile towers and conventional towers have totally different requirements. And that's something that you need to understand. And it's a good reason for reading the document. And the document's actually been created in consultation with the Health and Safety Executive, the Highways Authority, and the National Traffic Managers Forum. And all of those bodies have worked together to actually generate the information that's in there. But do remember, just because it says mobile, it's not always mobile. It may be on base plates, and it may be tied to the structure. The guidance in the document points out significant points related to mobile access towers in relation to the work at height regulations. One of those relates to two principles for the use of a mobile tower. And the regulations specify that you must have strength and stability calculations for scaffolding unless you have a note of calculations covering the structural arrangements contemplated or is in conformity with a generally recognised standard configuration. So if we're talking about a mobile tower that is just built to a manufacturer's guide, that's considered to be in accordance with a generally recognised standard configuration. And that would suffice as the documentation under the work at height regulations. But if it's not in conformance with a generally recognised standard configuration, if it's not straight out of a manufacturer's user guide, if it's a special individual configuration, then you need to have special calculations, you need to have a design, and you need to have an assembly, use and dismantling plan. Now that's an important part. You don't just want a pretty picture showing a scaffolding. Somewhere on there it's got to tell you how to build it, how to use it, and how to dismantle it. And once you've got that information, that needs to accompany any license that you put forward for use of a mobile tower on a highway. Again, in order to satisfy the requirements of the work at height regulations, the person who's responsible for the assembly, alteration, use and dismantling of the mobile tower needs to carry out a risk assessment and formulate a plan of work compliant with the regulations and recommendations, and that it should follow PASMA training, best practice, and the HSE guidance document CIS 10. The risk assessment needs to be written down. It's not something you do in your head and keep in your head. And it should be available to other parties working on or near the tower. And in some circumstances, it may be that the risk assessment's actually carried out in consultation with the highway authority in a site meeting. That's something that might be quite important. There's no point in doing a risk assessment, going to the highway authority, and them saying, well, that's not how we do it, or that's not what we want. You may as well do it in consultation in some circumstances. And then that copy of that risk assessment goes in with the licence application. We touched on the subject of competence, and the guidance points out that a requirement under the work at height regulations is for a person with the responsibility for assembly, alteration, use and dismantling to be competent. And competence is obviously required by the people actually building the tower, inspecting it, altering it and dismantling it. And you may want to think about the competence of the people actually using the tower. Are they actually competent to work at height? So you might have a competent person builds this fantastic structure, but is the person who goes up it and does the job competent to work at height? And can you prove that? Again, once you've got this evidence of training, that has to go in with the license application. Probably the most important thing about mobile towers is that you inspect them before you use them in the position of use, and a written report of that inspection is made available. In the case of mobile towers, that's normally provided by the completion of the PASMA tower inspection record. which looks like that. It's a green record that is affixed to the tower, and it's completed by a competent person before the tower is first used. And if the tower is going to be in use for more than 7 days, then it has to be re-inspected. You don't need to inspect a tower, especially a mobile tower, if every time it's moved. That's a question we get asked quite frequently. If I move it from there to there, do I need to inspect it? And the answer is no. You don't need to inspect it, not unless anything happens that may have jeopardized the safety of that tower. So if when you're moving it, you bump it into something, or if when you're moving it, you need to alter it significantly, then you would re-inspect it before you restarted work. And you need to keep copies of those records at your office for another 3 months after the work is finished. You should also carry out daily pre-use inspections. So that's a pre-use inspection is one that's not recorded, but it's carried out by a competent person. And they should look over the tower and just make sure that nothing has changed which could significantly affect its safety. You know, that there hasn't been a lightning storm in the night and half the structure's missing, or that somebody hasn't borrowed half of it and it's gone away. So you need to carry out, yes, I can see there's a few people who've experienced that. You need to carry out that pre-use check just to make sure all the parts are still there where they should be. And if you have a partially completed tower or one that's not correct to use, then you should mark it as such with a big sign at the bottom, do not use, okay? The inspection record, you reverse it to show the red side, which says do not use, and you record the reason why, you know, parts missing, tower incomplete. This guidance actually applies to all mobile towers, whether it's on the highway or not. So it doesn't matter. We're not talking now specifically in this point about towers on the highway. Inspection is the same for all towers. The other thing that you need to remember is where you do have a tower on the highway, you've got to maintain it in good condition. It's no good putting it up and then allowing it to deteriorate. So you need to make sure that you keep it in good order and that you keep it clean. If you're doing work on a site and the site is getting messy around the tower, obviously it's good housekeeping to make sure that you have some sort of cleaning process in place to make sure that everything stays safe. Whenever possible, mobile towers, and particularly those to be located in normally busy public areas, should be assembled and dismantled at the quiet times of a day. So if you can arrange to do it before you're in the middle of rush hour, and not in the middle of rush hour, it's always a good move, so that there's a reduced public presence around while you're actually doing any building, dismantling or adjustment. And you should give consideration to systems which separate pedestrians and vehicles from any hazards, and those systems should be in place throughout the whole duration of the task, including the assembly, the alteration and dismantling. And such systems should provide safe passage for people using wheelchairs, those with prams and pushchairs. We can't forget those in areas where the public have access. And think about people with particular needs, the elderly, the disabled, people with children. You could, for instance, put ramps over obstructions rather than putting in steps. We have a ramp here. It does the purpose. You could put in things like tapping boards around the structure or through the structure, so those that are visually impaired can find their way around and to assist them. The verticals of tower frames should be covered with high visibility, it's a very difficult word, visibility, black and yellow foam padding for the first 2 meters. Why black and yellow? because recent research has shown that that is the colour or the colours that actually stand out most to people with visual impairment. It used to be everything was painted white. That apparently isn't very good at all. It's black and yellow. And put a sign up, danger, men working overhead, and put that somewhere where it's visible to the general public. And put up fencing, as it shows you here. So we have a case here. We have a minimum footway width of 1.2 metres, which is the minimum required. Or if it's a walk-through frame, a minimum width through the walk-through area of 1.2 metres and 2.44 metres high. And put up signs and fencing to make sure people follow the right path through the obstructions. The other thing that you need to consider is protecting the public where there's a risk of being struck by anything falling. You need to take suitable and sufficient measures to make sure that that can't happen during, again, the whole course of the work. So that's through the use, the assembly, the use, the alteration, and any dismantling. And where there's a risk identified, you need to put in some sort of measure. That could be establishing a 4-metre no-go zone around the tower, or it could be providing a protective structure. And the design of the structure needs to be suitable depending on the site. You can't have this, there is no such thing as a common structure. They will vary depending on the site. But one of the things that you need to know is you never sheet, net, or fit fans to a mobile tower. You never sheet, net, or fit fans to a mobile tower. And the reason for that is they're not designed for it. They're not strong enough to accommodate sheeting. So in those circumstances, you would build, as it shows here, a protective structure alongside the tower, and that would prevent the pedestrian being struck by anything that fell from the tower. And you'd build in that 4-metre zone so that nothing can get within 4 metres of the tower. So again, nothing could be hit by anything falling. And at night, if the tower is going to stay there, you need to light it. And if you've got a vehicle barrier, that needs to be lit as well. And the lighting arrangements are that it has to be lit for half an hour before sunset to half an hour after sunset, with amber lights at both ends, red lights on projections, and white lights underneath for pedestrians. So let's have a look at the new guidance. The guidance has a template for local authorities, for highways authorities to use as a way of licensing mobile towers on the highway. And the information on there, as I said earlier, there is a similar license for traditional scaffolding, tube and fitting scaffolding, but the questions in here are significantly different because this relates specifically to mobile towers. Page 1 of the document gathers information about the person who's actually responsible for the management of the mobile tower. If a subcontract mobile tower contractor is employed to assemble and alter or dismantle the tower, but they're not responsible for the management and use of the tower, then it's the client who applies for the license. It's not the person who builds it necessarily, it's the person who's responsible for the use of the tower. That's an important point. As an example, if you hired a PASMA approved hire and assembly member to build a tower for you, but you were responsible for the works and for the tower, you would apply for the license. The only time the mobile tower contractor would actually apply for the license is if he's building something for a householder, and it's the householder who's going to do the work. Pages 2 and 3 are the checklists for critical points. And again, they're very specific to mobile towers. They're very different to traditional scaffolding issues. And it tells you all about the actual tower that you're going to build. And then finally, in the template, there are suggested conditions of license and suggested administration details. But the whole point is this is a template. We're not saying this is the way you must do it. Each licensing authority can look at this and they can vary it depending on their local regulations. And finally, at the back, in a very handy annex, you've got the relevant parts of the Highways Act, which you can look at, and it gives you all the information. Well, thank you for listening. That concludes the talk today. I hope you found it useful. If you have questions relating to the use of mobile towers on highways, I'll be at the back in the PASMA pod. Please come and talk to me. If you'd like copies of the documentation, then you can obtain it from the PASMA office or by leaving your details with the PASMA pod. Thank you very much for listening.